try and... Right. Okay, well, hello everyone. Noswaith dda, ymddiheuriadau. Apologies again for the rather rocky start. Anyway, I'll try and proceed fairly briskly through this. And thank you to everyone for turning up. So the Age of the Princes, an environmental perspective. To talk of the age of the Welsh princes is to characterise a period of medieval Welsh history in terms of struggles for power by native rulers of Wales, both amongst themselves, but also in the face of attempts at domination and conquest by marcher lords and kings of England. This evening, I take the period as extending from the recovery, in the case of Powys, reinvention of dynasties following the initial shock of early Norman conquests in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, down to the extinction of native rule by Edward I in the War of 1282-3. It's true that the Age of the Princes saw important social, economic, ecclesiastical, cultural and legal changes in Pŵr Walia, the areas under native rule. Nevertheless, these were connected to the prince's political ambitions and achievements. Historians, myself included, have paid less attention, though, to the ways in which the princes interacted with the physical environment of the lands they ruled over, and how environmental factors helped both to sustain and constrain their power. Admittedly, historians of Wales of all periods have mostly been reluctant to deal explicitly with environmental history. Wendy Davies is a notable exception for the early Middle Ages, despite this having become a burgeoning field of study with respect to many other parts of the world over the past half-century or so. This is not to suggest that these factors have been completely ignored. As elsewhere, historians have contributed to what some call de facto environmental history, especially by taking account of geographical influences and in studies of economic history. The former approach is exemplified by J. Lloyd and, as we'll see shortly, by the work of William Rees on the 14th century, notably in his remarkable map of South Wales and the March, and his discussion of forests in his earlier monograph on the same region. And I hardly need to remind the present audience that the same is even truer of historical geographers and landscape archaeologists, some of whose work has appeared on the pages of Archaeologia Cambrensis. Indeed, the importance of adopting an environmental perspective on Welsh history received de facto recognition almost a century ago in the lawyer H.J. Randall's presidential address to the Cambrians on landscape and history in Mid Glamorgan. Yet the challenge remains of integrating the approaches I've outlined into broader historical analyses in ways that take environmental factors seriously while avoiding environmental determinism that minimizes the adaptation of human beings to the physical conditions of the natural world of which they were a part. Now, this lecture makes only a very preliminary and selective attempt to address that challenge. It takes its cue from environmental historians' emphasis on the interaction of human beings and the natural world. Although scholars disagree about how precisely that interaction works and define environmental history in a variety of ways, the following summary by the medieval environmental historian Ellen Arnold conveys the field's general approach. To quote, in all definitions, it is the dynamism of an interest in both people and ecosystems that distinguishes environmental history, both from traditional historical fields and from fields like historical ecology and paleoclimatology. I should stress, though, that what follows makes no claim to be a fully developed example of environmental history. Rather, my aim is merely to offer some pointers as to how we might think about the significance of the environment for an understanding of the age of the Welsh princes. More specifically, I want to consider two aspects of people's relationship in the land summarized summarized on the slide here in the first part, in war, before then turning to aspects of their relationship in peace. As elsewhere in Britain and on the continent, war was environmentally destructive as it targeted the enemy's crops, livestock, and settlements. Here, however, I want to examine attempts to preserve such resources through the use of mountainous and wooded landscapes as refuges from and places from which to mount attacks against armies led or sent by kings of England. And there are plenty of parallels for sort of guerrilla warfare of this kind, as indicated on a couple of the slides there from quite recent periods. The second part of the discussion will then assess what transfers of lands by Welsh princes and lords to religious houses reveal about perceptions of the landscape in the exploitation of natural resources. I will focus mainly on 12th and 13th century written sources and try to show that these have much to reveal about this topic, especially if we read between the lines, as it were, and think about the context they imply. So the first part of the discussion will be based mainly on chronicles, histories, and other narrative sources written in Latin, and in the case of Brut y Tywysogion, the Chronicle of the Princes in Welsh, while the second part relies on the evidence of Latin charters. This means that I won't, on the whole, be considering other important sources composed in this period, including court poetry, praising the princes, Welsh prose tales, and above all, the Welsh law books, which contain numerous rules that would repay further attention as evidence for human interaction with the environment. One further introductory point to emphasize is that accounts of the natural world are coloured by assumptions about human relations with it. Indeed, it has been argued that investigating ideas about the natural world is itself an important aspect of environmental history. Medieval authors, while certainly aware of the landscapes, climate, flora, and fauna of the world they inhabited, did not have a concept of the environment in sort of modern sense. Rather, people in the non-human world were all part of God's creation, linked for more learned writers in a great chain of being. According to Gerald of Wales, in the second version of his Topography of Ireland, this chain extended from stones via trees and brute animals to man, and thence via angels to God. More generally, both the Bible and Latin classical writers shared an anthropocentric view of people's relationship with the earth as something to be dominated and tamed to serve human needs. Accordingly, domesticated agricultural landscapes were considered civilized, whereas wildernesses were not. This distinction was clearly pertinent to the predominantly mountainous and extensively wooded landscape of Wales, as we'll see. Furthermore, a tamed and productive nature might also give aesthetic pleasure to the senses. Consider, for example, Geoffrey of Monmouth's description of Britain right at the beginning of his History of the Kings of Britain, completed by about 1138, which draws heavily on Gildas's 6th century ruin of Britain. Geoffrey praises Britain as the best of islands, which, to quote again, supplies all human needs with its boundless productivity. Rich in metals of every kind, it has broad pastures and hills suitable for successful agriculture, in whose rich soil various crops can be harvested in their season. It has all kinds of wild beasts in its forests, and in its glades grow not only grasses suitable for rotating the pasture of animals, but flowers of various colours, which attract bees to fly to them and gather honey. He goes on that Britain also had green meadows pleasantly situated beneath lofty mountains, streams that softly murmur, and waters full of fish. A little later in the mid-12th century, the Latin life of Gruffydd ap Cynan, King of Gwynedd, who died in 1137, portrayed the king as having helped to civilize his land through the peace he achieved in the latter years of his reign, declaring that, to quote, throughout Gwynedd, all kinds of good things began to increase. Now the people began to found churches, sow acorns, plant trees, and build orchards and gardens, and surround them with pools, ditches, and fences, to construct buildings, and to gather for use the produce and fruits in the manner of the Romans. Gerald of Wales also evoked ancient Rome in his famous description of his birthplace of Manorbier, which you can see here, with its castle, fish pond, orchard, and tall hazel trees, surrounded by countryside, productive in wheat and the nearby sea full of fish, proclaiming it to be the loveliest place of all Wales, an explicit evocation of the classical literary topos of the locus amoenus. He said it was the locus amoenissimus, the most lovely place, a beautiful site that could include both natural features and the imprint of human endeavour. Well, moving on now to the first part of the main discussion, Wales's environment was an important context for war, as previous scholars have shown. In the early 20th century, J.E. Lloyd, who shared the widespread conviction among historians of his day that history could not be understood without taking account of geography and was highly attentive to Wales's topography, emphasised the importance of Snowdonia as a refuge at times of invasion and the advantages of mobility more generally conferred by what he portrayed as a primarily pastoral economy. More recently, Glanville Jones argued that the 13th century princes of Gwynedd enhanced the defensive capacity of their mountainous landscape by building stone castles and establishing vaccaries or cattle ranches in their vicinity, while William Linnard highlighted how woods presented obstacles to invading English armies, a challenge addressed most comprehensively by Edward I, who employed literally thousands of woodmen in and after his two Welsh wars to cut down trees in order to clear routes for his armies. Until then, however, the Welsh were able to take advantage of what both they and outsiders described as their wild or desert lands. In this, they weren't unique. Gerald of Wales describes the Irish taking refuge in woods and blocking passes with felled trees, a tactic also used by Saracens earlier in the Middle Ages, while the Vikings mustered armies in woods. Though less well attested, climatic conditions played a part too. As was generally the case in medieval Europe, campaigning was usually restricted to the months from spring to autumn. Thus, the Welsh chronicle Brita Tywysogio noted that in 1121, Henry I led a campaign against Powys to, quote, as soon as summer came and the roads were dry, and it was easy to find and follow paths. By contrast, the same chronicle shows that Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Llywelyn the Great, and his allies were able to lead extensive campaigns in southwest Wales over 3 weeks in December 1215, beginning in the Tawy Valley and ending in southern Ceredigion just after Christmas, because of the unseasonably mild weather. To quote, and while that war lasted, so great was the mildness of the air and the fine weather that a winter as mild as it was never seen nor heard of before that. The campaigns resulted in the capture of 9 castles, including the royal strongholds of Carmarthen and Cardigan, and marked a crucial stage in Llywelyn's assertion of overlordship in southwest Wales, which was sealed in early 1216 by his partition of Deheubarth among descendants of the Lord Rhys at Aberdyfi, on the border of Deheubarth and Gwynedd. The Chronicle of the Princes refers frequently to the Welsh taking refuge in mountainous or wooded areas between the late 11th and late 13th centuries, a picture supported by other Welsh as well as Anglo-Norman and English narrative sources. Such movements not only took women, children, and livestock out of harm's way, but made it difficult for hostile armies to engage effectively with Welsh warriors, who took advantage of their intimate knowledge of wild lands to ambush enemies who tried to penetrate them while avoiding battles on open ground. We're not told how these evacuations were organised. However, the accounts clearly imply that a sufficient number of those taking refuge were closely familiar with the wooded or mountainous landscapes in which they hid, and thus able to find suitable routeways as well as to accommodate and feed both humans and livestock taking refuge. More specifically, even though such evacuations presumably involved more people, at least, and for many may well have covered greater distances than the annual movements of cattle to summer pastures, transhumance presumably provided relevant experience. Also relevant is Gerald of Wales's observation that the Welsh, to quote, in time of peace and youth, deliberately practice penetrating right into woods and groves and moving rapidly over mountain summits, continuing in this labour day and night without interruption. Activities he coupled with the weapons training they undertook in readiness for war. Familiarity with the terrain is also implicit in Gerald's comment that the Welsh, to quote, love dark nights and storms for mounting incursions on the enemy. One consequence of this familiarity was that, at least until Edward I's time, Welsh rulers were less deterred than English kings by the challenges posed by the Welsh landscape. Thus, the biographer of Gruffydd ap Cynan states that after defeating his enemies at the Battle of Mynydd Carn in 1081, to quote, Gruffydd, as was his usual habit in victory, pursued them through forests, valleys, marshes, and mountains throughout the night by the light of the moon. So hardly any of his enemies who survived the battle managed to get home. Two areas stand out in the sources as providing refuges for people and livestock in time of war. One was Cantref Mawr, modern Carmarthenshire, described by Gerald as the safest refuge for the inhabitants of South Wales in times of need, owing to the abundant density of its woods. This had been shown in 1158 when the Chronicle Brita Tywysogion relates that in response to Henry II's campaign against him, the Lord Rhys moved all Deheubarth and their wives and children and all their animals to the forest land of the Tywi. Admittedly, Rhys still submitted to the king. However, he retained his possession of Cantref Mawr, and presumably his people and livestock were preserved from harm. Since this and other accounts focus on the protective capacity of Cantref Mawr and other wooded areas, their descriptions are cast in general terms without commenting in detail on the density of cover or identifying individual species of trees. That woods such as those of Cantref Mawr could support humans and livestock, even for short periods, suggests, though, that they contained some open areas, including wood pasture, rather than consisting of an unbroken canopy of trees. More generally, the use of wooded areas as refuges implies the Welsh were able not only to navigate their way through these, but also to manage them and exploit their resources. The last point is supported by the Welsh law book's rules on the value and uses of different species of trees and the management of woodland, and is implied by references to rights over woodland granted in charters, to which I'll come back. The area named most frequently as a refuge, moreover, was Snowdonia. I mentioned J. Lloyd earlier, and as he pointed out, its defensive value was greatly enhanced by the proximity of a low-lying fertile Anglesey behind it, as well as its own extensive summer pastures in the valleys of Nant Francon and Nanhwynan, Nant Gwynant, encircled in green there on the map. Resources acknowledged by Gerald's assertion that just as Anglesey could produce enough grain, the pastures of Eryri were sufficient to feed all the flocks of Wales. Writing of Owain ap Cadogan of Powys, faced by Henry I's invasion in 1114, the Chronicle of the Princes reports that he gathered his men and all their chattels along with them and moved into the mountains of Eryri, for that was the wildest and safest place to which to retreat. According to his life, Gruffydd ap Cynan did the same on that occasion, sending, to quote, his valuables with the wives and children across into the deserted areas of the mountains of Snowdonia, where they would be out of any fear of danger. Likewise, his great-grandson, Llewellyn the Great, to quote, had Perfeddwlad, the four cantrefs east of the River Conwy, and Anglesey, at all their chattels, moved to the wilderness of Eryri, in response to King John's first unsuccessful campaign against Gwynedd in 1211. In his elegy for Griffith ap Cynan, who died in 1137, the poet Meilir Brydydd, apparently referring to Henry I's 1114 campaign, emphasized the value attached to cattle, declaring that the king, I translate, came with an army, but although he came, he did not take cattle as plunder. We were wealthy in Snowdonia. The King of England did not break through into pasture that was full of herds. Similarly, the next century, Matthew Paris, writing in St. Albans, reported that the Welsh, in response to news of a planned campaign against them by Henry III in 1257, to quote, prudently moved their wives, children, and cattle into the interior of the land, namely Snowdonia, places both mountainous and inaccessible to the English. Snowdonia was not only a source, but a symbol of the strength of the princes of Gwynedd. Poets celebrated Snowdonia as a refuge and sometimes played on its Welsh name of Eryri to compare Gwyned's rulers with the eagles living there. Thus, praise poems to Llywelyn ap Iorwerth and his grandson Llywelyn ap Gruffydd hail the princes as respectively being, to quote, of the race of the eagles of Snowdonia, o Hil Eryron o Eryri, and eagle of Snowdonia, Eryr Snawdon. Such thinking presumably helps to explain Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's choice of the title Lord of Snowdonia, when, very probably in May 1230, he changed the style used in his official documents from Llywelyn, Prince of North Wales, to Llywelyn, Prince of Aberfraw and Lord of Snowdonia. More attention has been paid to the first of these titles, which effectively claimed for Llywelyn the status of Prince of Wales, since, according to the Welsh laws, the other Welsh kings owed gold to the King of Aberfraw, regarded as the chief court of Gwynedd, who in turn paid gold to the King of London, England. Lord of Snowdonia, on the other hand, has been seen as referring to Llywelyn's patrimonial principality of Gwynedd. And that's clearly the case. But the choice of the mountain range for the title, unparalleled among European rulers in this period, as far as I know, may well have also evoked ideas current among Welsh literati of Snowdonia as an immovable symbol of strength. Moreover, the choice of the English word snawdon in the Latin documents and indeed in the poem I cited a moment ago, which in this period primarily referred, like the Welsh Eryri, to the whole mountain range rather than the highest mountain, Yr Wyddfa, ensured that it was comprehensible to non-Welsh recipients of the prince's letters, including kings of England. It may therefore also have been intended to remind recipients of the mountainous landscape crucial to the defence of Gwynedd, as recognised by a variety of sources from the late 11th century onwards. For example, Gerald of Wales described Gwynedd as being, to quote, better fortified on account of the situation of its lands than South Wales. Gerald's assertion that Gwynedd was defended by its landscape belongs to a wider discourse that attributed the ability of the Welsh to defend themselves not to their own actions, but to the natural environment itself. This was a view taken by several 12th century English historians. Thus, William of Malmesbury explained that while successful in campaigns elsewhere, William II failed in Wales because of, to quote, the roughness of the country and the inclement climate. While, according to Henry of Huntingdon, the king saw that the Welsh could not be defeated, more from the nature of the terrain than from their valour and arms. It was only a short step from portraying the Welsh as beneficiaries of their wild landscape to characterising them as the landscape's bestial progeny. Occasional references to the Welsh emerging from or retreating to caves, lairs, or other hiding places carry imputations of primitiveness, even similarity to non-human animals. In particular, the Latin nouns latibula and latebra, both used in these contexts, could refer to an animal's den or lair, though their meaning had extended to hiding place more generally in medieval Latin. Some 12th century writers were less subtle. The mid-12th century Gesta Stephani, Deeds of Stephen, written by the Bishop of Bath, Robert, explicitly compared the Welsh with beasts. To quote, now Wales is a country of woodland and pasture, abounding in deer and fish, milk and herds, but it breeds men of an animal type, naturally swift-footed, accustomed to war, volatile always in breaking their word as in changing their abodes. For the bishop, the antithesis between settled agriculture and wild nature I mentioned earlier represented a contrast between civilization and barbarism, which justified the conquest of Wales by the Normans, who, to quote the text again, perseveringly civilized it after they had vigorously subdued its inhabitants. To encourage peace, they imposed law and statutes on them, and they made the land so productive and abounding in all kinds of resources that you would have reckoned it in no wise inferior to the most fertile parts of Britain. Or even more strikingly, he describes Richard Fitzgilbert making his lordship of Ceredigion so to abound in peace and varied productivity that it might very easily have been thought a second England. In the 1190s, the historian William of Newburgh, an Augustinian canon in Yorkshire, expressed similar views. Introducing his account of Henry II's campaign against Owain Gwynedd in 1157, he stated that the landscape of Wales provided a refuge for the Welsh that helped them to resist conquest and thus ensure their survival as a people. However, this had been achieved at the cost of degeneracy. The Welsh, he wrote, are known to be the remnants of the Britons, who were the first inhabitants of this island. However, after the Britons were subject to destruction by the onslaught of the English peoples, those who could escape took refuge in Wales, which was safe from the enemy's invasion through nature's help. And this nation persists there to the present day. There follows a description of Wales as a land, to quote again, almost entirely surrounded by either the sea or impassable woodland and other difficulties. Accordingly, it is most difficult to approach or enter. Within it, moreover, it is known to have certain recesses that cannot be escaped, so that just as it is dangerous for any powerful man to enter it with an army, so it's impossible to move around inside it with an army. Moreover, the land's wildness, while facilitating resistance, also had negative consequences for the Welsh, for, to quote, the country begets, in accordance with its nature, men barbarous in their customs, bold and faithless, greedy for the blood of foreigners, prodigal of their own, always longing for plunder and threatening the English people with a hatred as though transmitted by nature. Writing a year or two before William, it seems, Gerald of Wales also stressed that their landscape had ensured the survival of the Welsh. This went beyond his comment in the description of Wales around 1194 on the advantages enjoyed by Gwynedd that I mentioned before. More generally, Wales was, to quote, a land defended most strongly by high mountains, deep valleys, boundless woods, rivers and marshes. So much so that from the time the Saxons first occupied the island, the remnants of the Britons who withdrew to these parts have never been wholly conquered. By contrast, those Britons that withdrew to Cornwall were unable to resist, to quote, because the land is not defended to such a degree. However, unlike William of Newburgh, or as well as his own writing on the Irish, Gerald did not conclude that the Welsh were bestial barbarians. He also offered a more acute analysis than William and other writers of the environmental advantages enjoyed by the Welsh against English conquest and colonisation. On the one hand, in his advice on how to conquer Wales, in his description of Wales, he urged that a campaign against them should be mounted during, or better still, towards the end of winter, to quote, when the woods lack their leaves and the mountains their pastures. No less interesting, there is a story Gerald tells in the journey round Wales, finished about 1191, of how, after the capture of the Lord Rhys in 1163, the rural dean of Cantref Mawr, the area I showed on the map a little earlier, a Welshman called Gwion, was ordered to escort a trusted Breton knight charged by Henry II with reporting on Dynevor Castle and its surroundings. The Welsh rural dean ignored instructions to take the knight by the easiest way, instead led him through the most difficult and inaccessible approaches. Moreover, he periodically stopped to eat grass, saying that the area's inhabitants relied on grasses and roots in times of famine. Well, this had the desired effect, as Rhys was allowed to return home after the knight informed the king to quote, that it was an uninhabitable land, an impassable and inaccessible land, having the necessities of life only for a bestial people living in the manner of beasts. Now, of course, it should be stressed the story can't be verified, but it does at least suggest, first, that outsiders were dependent on native assistance to make their way through such land, and second, that Gerald could envisage the Welsh resisting their enemies by taking advantage of Anglo-French preconceptions of Welsh barbarism rooted in Wales's landscape. The first point is consistent with the numerous accounts of the Welsh hiding in and sallying forth from mountainous or wooded terrain, including at night. The second, with outsiders' descriptions, as in this case, of such terrain as being inaccessible or impassable. The reliance on a Welsh clergyman as a guide in Gerald's story may be compared with the Teutonic Knights' reliance on native guides, called Leitsreuter, to traverse the wilderness of the vast wetlands and dense forests of the Prussian-Lithuanian frontier as they sought to conquer the pagan population of Lithuania. However, what Patrick Meehan has called the repurposing of local knowledge as a tool of Teutonic lordship, documented in numerous reports from 1384 to 1402, was far more systematic and for the most part more successful than the presumably ad hoc recruitment of Gerald's wily rural dean. Well, so far then, I've concentrated on sources that refer to the landscape in fairly general terms and tried to tease out some implications for human uses and attitudes to the environment. In the second and final part of the lecture, I want to turn to a different body of sources that describe landscapes in considerable detail, namely charters issued by Welsh rulers, mostly in favour of religious houses. These provide valuable evidence for the landscape and other aspects of the environment in particular places and at particular times. During the age of the princes, some of the documents bear dates, others are usually datable within at most a few decades. Most of these record gifts or confirmations of lands that are described in what technically are known as dispositive clauses. Two aspects of these clauses are relevant here. First, in many cases, charters give descriptions of the boundaries of the lands granted that refer to rivers, mountains, ditches, and other landscape features, a characteristic of both Anglo-Saxon and pre-Norman Welsh charters, also found in the north of England and Scotland in the 12th and 13th century, in contrast to the more concise descriptions of places in English royal charters of that period. Although Welsh charters differ from some of their Scottish counterparts in lacking explicit references to perambulators walking or riding the bounds, the naming of topographical features and descriptions of boundaries implies that these were sufficiently well known, at least to serve as durable evidence of the location of the lands granted. Second, whether describing boundaries or briefly naming the lands given, charters usually include a list of what are called appurtenances, that is, rights or liberties belonging to the lands granted. Now, such lists had their origins in late antiquity and were common in medieval European charters. Their appearance in 12th and 13th century Welsh charters may reflect Norman influence, as appurtenances are largely absent from pre-Norman Welsh charters. The number and type of liberties vary from, for example, in wooded land and open land, in meadows and pastures, to much longer lists of the kinds of lands and appurtenances granted. Thus, a charter for Strata Masella Abbey in 1198 states that Meirig ap Howell of Arwystli in Mid Wales had granted the land of Cwm Llwyd, quote, in wooded land and open land, in cultivated and uncultivated land, in meadows and pastures, in marshes and grazing lands, in fisheries and fishing places, above that land and below it. Now, since the lists of appurtenances vary according to the preferences of the monastic scribes who actually drafted the charters, and thus from one religious house to another, it's uncertain how far they were merely formulaic without necessarily reflecting conditions on the ground. Studies of continental European charters addressing this question have reached differing conclusions. Suffice it to say here that at the very least, the listing of the different legal rights granted with the land suggests that in Wales as elsewhere, the resources thus conveyed were deemed sufficiently important to be worth specifying, albeit to varying degrees. Now, as Matthew Griffiths pointed out almost 40 years ago with respect to the charters for Margam Abbey and Glamorgan, charters offer a different perspective on social change and territorial organisation from the post-conquest extents of North Wales combined with 13th century combinations of Welsh law, an approach exemplified, for example, by the work of T. Jones Pierce and Glanville Jones. As scholars since Frederick Seabohm have shown, the extents allow us to map the organisation of the lands ruled by the princes of Gwynedd, including the location of vaccaries, and refer back to both renders in kind and cash rents owed by the prince's free and unfree tenants. These sources also help to inform Gwynedd Archaeological Trust's investigations of the networks of the princes Llysoedd and Maerdrefi, their courts and the administrative centres or court sites the sort of settlement sites around the courts, as well as deserted rural settlements. While charters, as records of grants of lands in particular areas, offer a less systematic picture than the extents, they offer unique snapshots of the landscape and of how its significance was perceived at specific points or periods in time. Their potential in this respect has been shown, moreover, by assessments of what charters can tell us about territorial organisation, as these have touched, albeit fairly briefly, on aspects of the environment such as the integration of lowland arable and meadow with upland grazing. Important cases in point include Colin Gresham's detailed topographical studies of lands granted to the abbeys of Aberconwy and Cymer, the work of Matthew Griffiths and more recently Élodie Papin on the Margam charters, and David Austin and Gemma Besant's analyses of charters for Strata Florida and other religious houses in their studies of landscapes in southwest Wales. In considering what charters can tell us about the environment, I'll begin with water before returning to mountains and forests. Rivers and streams, usually named, are the most common natural features mentioned as boundary markers. These also pose challenges to travellers, as indicated by occasional mentions of fords and bridges in descriptions of boundaries. Marshes were a further aspect of watery landscapes. These appear among the natural features in boundary clauses and sometimes in lists of appurtenances attached to the land granted, implying that they provided economic benefits. For example, salt marshes were used to pasture livestock and occasionally as meadow in lands along the Glamorgan coast granted to Margam. Water also made an essential contribution to the medieval diet in Wales as elsewhere in Europe, as a source both of fish and of energy for mills used primarily as labour-saving machines for grinding grain. Both types of exploitation of water resources are evidenced in the charters I've examined, not only in general terms in lists of appurtenances, but also in descriptions of specific lands. The value attached to catching fish is demonstrated by grants of fishing rights, fisheries, fish traps or weirs, and occasionally, by the later 13th century, fish ponds. Mills are referred to by the Latin noun molendinum without further elaboration, apart from indicating their location in some instances. However, since watermills are surely meant, the references presuppose the availability of water to power their wheels and thus their millstones. They also support the well-established case that, for all of Gerald of Wales's emphasis on the Welsh people's predominant reliance on meats and dairy products, there was a substantial demand for cereals. Fishing and milling could be combined, moreover, as mill ponds were often used to trap fish in this period. This may have been true of Cenarth Mawr on the River Tavy. An agreement between princes of Deheubarth and the Bishop of St. David's in 1222 refers to a mill and a fish trap there, which were evidently considered valuable, being the only appurtenances of Cenarth explicitly named in the document. That the mill and fish trap were connected is further suggested by Gerald of Wales's somewhat earlier description of Cenarth Mawr as the site of a salmon fishery, where stood the church of St. Llawddog and, quote, a mill with a bridge and fishery. Some charters explicitly refer to lands as mountains. We're moving on now to mountains and woods, back to those. Montana. This designation was predicated on the perceived contrast with the lower lying land below them, rather than on altitude as such. Excuse me. The mountains mentioned in charters thus vary in height from, for example, Mynydd Dinas, there on the left, rising to 258 metres above the marsh of the Avon estuary, above Aberafon and Port Talbot today, to the summit of yr Wyddfa Fawr, Snowdon, over 1,000 metres above sea level. The character of mountain landscapes, including the vegetation they could sustain, also varied according to the elevation of valley bottoms. I'll return to one example shortly. The naming of mountain ridges and peaks as landmarks in boundary clauses provides further evidence of familiarity with these landscapes. This is well exemplified by the descriptions of lands in Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's 1209 charter for Cymer Abbey, which includes the summits of the Rhobell Fawr, which is shown, I think, there on the top right, and marked on the map, as well as Ddiallt and Moel yr Wden in Meirionnydd and Ardudwy, the highest of which, the Rhobell Fawr, rises to over 730 metres above sea level. Above all, though, mountains are described as providing pasture rights. The descriptions vary in detail. The Lord Rhys opened his charter for Strata Florida in 1184 with a general declaration that he had increased not only the abbey's unwooded and agricultural land, but also, to quote, its mountain land for the pasture of animals. More specifically, a number of rulers granted religious houses rights to use common pasture in mountains. In some cases, these were identified in fairly broad terms as extending over particular provinces such as Arwystli, Ceredigion, Ceri, Cyfeiliog, Deheubarth and Meilienydd. It's worth adding that charters assume that the boundaries between provinces were clearly defined and well known. But we also find descriptions of smaller areas defined by rivers. For example, to quote, the common pasture of all my land in the mountains between the Afan and Neath that Morgan ap Caradog granted to Margam in the 1190s. Here the mountains mostly rose from about 50 metres to below 300 metres above sea level, though they reached 370 metres on the summit of Foel Fynydau, which was near Mynydd Dinas, I showed a little earlier. A similar but more precise description is found in a charter of Hywel ap Iorwerth, Lord of Caerleon, in favour of Goldcliff, a Benedictine priory dependent on Bec in Normandy, which grants, to quote, one pasture in the mountains, namely between the Rhymney and the Sirhowy rivers, sufficient for 40 cows and their calves, 20 mares and their foals, and 100 sheep with their lambs. The inclusion of these estimates points up the economic value of such mountains, and more particularly their use in the rearing of livestock. The numbers given may indicate that the livestock supported by the pasture had been counted and recorded before the land was given to the monks. This was more mountainous terrain than the mountain pastures granted to Margam in the previous charter I mentioned, since the valley bottoms of the Rhymney and Syrhowy, which I tried to show here on the map, lay about 250 meters above sea level, with the land above rising to almost 490 meters on the summit of Mynydd Bedwellder, encircled in red there on the map. That lands granted to religious houses would normally include woods is implied by common formulae listing the land's appurtenances beginning in wood and open land. But quite a few charters are more specific. Thus, descriptions of the lands granted sometimes indicate the location of individual woods, usually referred to by the noun nemus, as for instance in Howlap Ieuaf of Arwistli's grant to Hormond Abbey of, to quote, all the land of Kilcaerenydd, with all the adjacent wood. Or more precisely, Howlap Cadwallon's charter for Cwm Hir, shown here at the top of the slide, which grants 4 acres, presumably of arable land, and a third of a meadow, and then to quote, and 2 wooded places thickly covered by brambles on either side of that meadow. As elsewhere in Europe, we also find references to woods as sources of pannage or mast for pigs and the payments due for using these. Thus, Howlap Ieuaf granted the Church of St. Michael in Treveglwys Arwystli, quote, quittance from pannage for all its pigs in the wood of Penpris. While in the southeast, Howlap Iorwerth of Caerleon granted the monks of Glastonbury the right to use his woods at Basaleg to pasture their pigs free of pannage dues. But the economic benefits of woodland went beyond acorns and beech or hazelnuts for fattening pigs. They would almost certainly have included open areas or glades providing pasture for cattle or horses. Admittedly, explicit references to this are lacking in the charters I've looked at so far. Although in classical Latin, nemus denoted, to quote, a wood with open glades and meadows for cattle, by the Middle Ages it was used mainly for woodland in general, so the use of the word on its own needn't signify wood pasture. On the other hand, since it was claimed by virtue of forest rights, the pasture pertaining to 3 houses in Glamorgan, whose ownership was disputed between Welsh landowners and Margam Abbey, may have been located in woodland. Other woodland resources are described less ambiguously. In the early 13th century, Cadwallon Morgan of the Welsh dynasty of Upland Glamorgan granted Margam Abbey an extensive upland area around Resolven, including, to quote, all the benefits of all the woodland situated within the aforesaid boundaries, both honey and birds, and all other benefits produced by the same woodland. Woodland beasts numbered among the rights that Llywelyn ap Iorwerth granted to the monks of Cymer, and Howlap Iorwerth granted Goldcliff Priory tithes not only of pannage in a named wood, but also of his orchard in Caerleon, his hunting and woodland honey. The reference to hunting may imply the exercise of forest rights. The forest, as a legally defined area subject to forest law, was introduced to Britain by the Normans. At its heart was woodland, wood pasture, or other rough land in which deer were kept for hunting by the Lord, though the legal forest usually extended beyond that. The earliest known example in Wales, mentioned in Domesday Book, was established in Flintshire by Hugh, Earl of Chester. However, a century later, Howlap Iorwerth of Caerleon was one of the few native Welsh rulers known to have had a forest, for in another charter for Goldcliff Priory he granted the monks to, quote, whatever they need in my forest of Gwynllwg, so that they may have all the liberties and free customs in all things pertaining to my forest. Woods were also important sources of raw material for both building and fuel. In taking Margam Abbey's Grange of Llanfaethyn under his protection, the Glamorgan Lord Maredydd ap Caradog granted the monks the right to take timber and fuel from his wood. In his charter of the foundation of Vallecrucius Abbey around 1200, Madog ap Gruffydd granted the monks the right to cut down trees, presumably for use as raw materials or to burn them, while Llywelyn granted Basingstoke Abbey osiers for making houses and hedges. Llywelyn's charter is unusual in naming a species of tree. Species are also occasionally named as boundary markers, like the alder grove in a portion of the marsh of Avon granted to Margam, and a chestnut tree in one of Howell ap Iorwerth's charters for Goldcliff. In addition, the reference in the latter document to Howell's orchard at Caerleon implies the growing of apple or other fruit-bearing trees. And of course, the fairly frequent references to rights of pannage presuppose the presence of oak, beech, or hazel. Nevertheless, the rarity of such details points up the limitations of charters as evidence for woodland, limitations that reflect their purpose as legal documents drafted to provide sufficient information to describe the lands conveyed, rather than as detailed surveys of the flora and fauna found on those lands. This in turn underlines the need to combine the testimony of charters with other written sources, notably in the case of Wales, the compilations of native law, whose earliest surviving versions were made in this period. As William Linnard noted, between them the different versions of the laws refer to 11 species of tree. Most of these are assigned values that varied according to their usefulness to people, oak being the most valuable, followed by beech, though that's absent in law books from North Wales where beech didn't grow. Tudur Davies's recent survey of pollen evidence, datable to the period 1100 to 1500, is suggestive too, notwithstanding the geographical distribution of the 56 sites reviewed, most of which are located in highland areas, and the infrequent sampling from most sites. This lists 8 tree species commonly attested by the pollen samples reviewed, all but 2 of which, namely birch and hornbeam, also appear in the laws. Well, to conclude what's been rather a rapid sort of gallop across a lot of different things, written sources can't, of course, tell us everything about the environment in the age of the Welsh princes. However, I think it remains important to try and assess what they can tell us, not only explicitly, but also implicitly, also always bearing in mind their purposes and conventions. Selective though this discussion has been, I hope it's pointed to 2 ways in particular in which written sources can contribute to an environmental history of 12th and 13th century Wales. First, they offer valuable insights into human attitudes to and perceptions of the non-human world, thereby illuminating cultural ideas about nature. Second, this in turn allows us to use written sources more critically as evidence that can help to throw light on Wales's medieval environments. Thank you.
I don't know whether you can hear me. My internet is doing very strange things. Yeah, but thank you. Thank you very much.